Well, it's a pleasure to be here to share a very sad story with you. And the kind of information that we'll be sharing with you as a panel, I hope will achieve two fundamental things. First of which is to raise some important public awareness about a persistent problem in our province for which there are many readily available solutions. And in raising that awareness, we hope that you will join with us in raising other people's awareness, sharing this information with the view of changing public policies that would see more opportunities and more possibilities for children in our province. I'm going to spend a few minutes walking over some of the key data points that have been brought forward in this year's report card. And of course, I would encourage you to have your friends read this document. There's been a couple of versions of it. There's a short version of it and a long version. And then there's a wonderful website that has a number of maps. First Call has done a tremendous job with its partners this year in bringing forward some very troubling facts. And jumping into those facts, we'll move right into the first one, which is that in British Columbia, 1 in 5 children lives in poverty. That's 1 in 5 children that will likely challenge with having enough food to eat, having appropriate housing, having adequate access to opportunities. And what that means is that 167,810 children will go without. That's enough to fill Disneyland 4 times over. What is more is that this rate of child poverty in British Columbia has worsened over time. Adrian set us up to remember this morning what November 24th means. It means remembering that in 1989, our House of Commons and all of the parties within it passed a resolution to end child poverty in the year 2000. In that year, in 1989, the child poverty rates in BC were 15.5%. Well, today we sit at 20.4%. Child poverty since that resolution has in fact gotten worse. There is some good news. When we shrink the timeline of focus and concentrate on the period of time between 2000 and 2013, using the low-income measure as our measure of poverty, we see that in the year 2000, there was 221,220 children that were living in poverty. And in 2013, as mentioned a minute ago, there was 167,810. What this means is that there are 53,410 fewer children living in poverty over that time. Now, while that may be a heartening downward trend, it is pitifully slow change year over year when we look at the difference between last year and this year. Last year, there was 169,420 children, and that's 1,610 more children than there were this year. That rate of change is unacceptable, and we can certainly decrease child poverty rates by far more if we put our minds to it together. The issue of poverty, of course, is a problem that looks differently depending on the kinds of families that we're talking about. And what we know in BC is that lone parent families are disproportionately affected by the issue of poverty. In fact, 1 in every 2 children living in lone parent households was poor in 2013. What is more is that we are seeing an increase in the percentage of children in lone parent families that are living in poverty. In 2010, 48.9% of all children living in lone parent families lived in poverty. And in 2013, 50.3% of all children in lone parent families are living in poverty. This is an increase that we cannot accept. This story gets even more troubling when we start looking how deep in poverty are families living. When we look at couple families with children, we see that the poverty line for this family type is $29,531 a year. So couple families with 1 child are living off of $29,531 a year. Now, of all of those families that live below that line of income, we can ask a question about what is their median income? And when we ask that question, we get a real troubling answer. The median income for couples with one child that live below the poverty line is 17,680. That means that they're living 40% below the poverty line. This year's report card looks beyond just income and recognizes that poverty has multiple dimensions. And food and housing are other dimensions of poverty that are important for us to consider. The good work of Food Banks Canada and their annual release of the hunger count helps us see that in BC alone, in 2014, 97,369 people accessed food banks. This is an increase of 25% since 2008 alone. What is worse is that in 2014, 29,990 of those food bank users were children. Too many families are unable to afford the cost of food, and too many families are similarly unable to afford the cost of housing. We know in BC and in Metro Vancouver in particular, the high cost of housing pushes many people out of possibility and opportunity for a good quality of life. This year's report card looks at the prevalence of children that are living in households that are in core housing need. A core housing need is a measure of housing security, and we can understand it as consisting of three standards. Adequacy, or the housing does not require any major repairs. Affordability, which means that the dwelling's costs would be 30% or lower of the total annual before-tax income of the dwelling occupants. And suitability, which means that there's simply enough bedrooms for the household. BC has the highest rate of core housing need for children in two-parent families in Canada, and it has the second highest rate of core housing need for children in lone-parent families. These are disappointing facts. Some people think that if people just worked harder, they wouldn't be poor. Well, the fact is that jobs in this region often don't pay enough, and they often don't pay enough in other parts of this province either. In 2011, nearly 32% of poor children in BC lived in families that had at least one adult working full-time, full year. People are working hard and still falling behind. And for those who are accessing their right to welfare, those welfare rates are sorely inadequate for meeting the costs of living that continue to grow year over year, as anyone familiar with the Consumer Price Index will reveal. If we look at couples with two children, their annual income from income assistance was $22,041. Now, the poverty line for that same household was $34,740. This is a difference of $12,701 that families receiving income assistance are experiencing a gap of over $1,000 a month. What is worse is that there is a stagnation. And in fact, if we take a look at the report card, we see a troubling decrease in the value of income assistance rates over time. In 1989, for a couple with two children, the income they would receive from income assistance was $23,328. That's converted into 2013 dollars. That same amount of income assistance for a couple with two children was $22,041. What that means is that the value of income assistance in 2013 compared to 1989 has in fact decreased by $1,287. At the same time, the cost of living increases regularly year over year, generally at a rate at 2% and a bit. The problem of poverty affects every region in this province. We have 29 regional districts in BC. 23 of those 29 regional districts have at least 1,000 poor children living in them. The regional district with the highest child poverty rates are Central Coast Regional District, Mount Waddington, and Skeena Queen Charlotte Regional District. The regional district with the lowest child poverty rates are East Kootenay, Peace River, and Northern Rockies. The maps on the website, still 1 in 5, help reveal some of the changes in child poverty rates by regional district from last year to this year. And I'd encourage you and your friends to take a look at those maps and situate themselves in that provincial map or in the city that they live, in the neighborhood that they live, and ask themselves, how many poor kids live here? What sorts of changes would be needed? And what is it that we can do to help advance those changes? The good news is that change is possible. And we know for certain that government help is the biggest driver of that change. We know that this last year for the data, 2013, saw that before government transfers and tax benefits were added, there was 231,700 children that lived in poverty. After government transfers were added to family income, that number went down to 167,810. That means that 63,890 children were lifted out of poverty thanks to us as the collective, the government. The other bit of good news is that some provinces are doing a great job. Quebec managed to reduce its child poverty rates by 47% by having their government play an active role committing to reducing child poverty. Sadly, BC ranks amongst the least helpful provinces in addressing issues of child poverty, down at the bottom of the barrel with Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, with a meager reduction of only 28% in child poverty as a result of government transfers. So what needs to happen? How can we start to fix some of the broken promises around child poverty, of which they seem to fly around every few years in our legislatures and our houses of government? Well, it starts with a very clear goal, and First Call and its coalition members have identified a very clear goal, and it's an achievable one. And it's that the federal, provincial, and local governments take action to achieve a reduction of BC's child poverty rate to 7% or less by 2020. There's several specific things that can be done. Some of these things are government-led initiatives, others involve a role for business, and others involve a role from civil society organizations. Collectively, these are all changes that are possible. And some of them start very simplistically with the question of wages. We call for a rise in the minimum wage to $15 an hour and indexed annually thereafter to account for increases in the cost of living. We call for a regular living wage payment to all regular and contract employees. We know that income and disability assistance rates are woefully inadequate in meeting the cost of needs, and we call for their immediate increase to step in line with the actual costs of living and indexed to the increases in cost of living over time. We also call the provincial government to immediately end the clawback of federal maternity and paternal leave benefits from those on income and disability assistance. We also see opportunities for the federal government to continue to pay child benefits to grandparents on CPP disability who are raising their grandchildren after they turn 65. This past year marked an important year with the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's final report, and in there are calls for collaboration to develop long-term poverty eradication strategy in collaboration with First Nations and other Aboriginal organizations to address the unequal and extremely high rates of child poverty in First Nations communities and among urban Aboriginal populations. We also call for the provincial government to adopt and start implementing the $10 a day childcare plan put forward by the Early Childhood Educators of BC and the Coalition of Childcare Advocates of BC. We also know that Canada is a very welcoming place, and I think we are all encouraged to see the increased role that is being taken in opening our doors to Syrian refugees. Sadly, part of the practice that this country has is to place heavy debt loads on those refugees that call Canada home. And therefore, we call for an immediate cancellation of all outstanding refugee transportation loan debt and cease seeking repayment of transportation costs for new refugees coming to Canada. And finally, I'll just sum up with a comment on the housing front. We know that housing is a challenge in this region and in this province, and we call for the federal and provincial government to increase their efforts to provide more appropriate housing for low-income people. This involves enhancing and expanding rental subsidies and other income supports to families living in or near poverty so as to reduce their housing insecurity. There's 21 recommendations in total, and among all of the coalition partners in First Call, there are many more exceptionally smart, cost-effective ways of addressing this issue. A great report a number of years ago by CCPA on the cost of poverty illuminates that not acting costs us more than doing something. And so let's think about what that something is together and hear more now from folks that have great insights in what that something more can be. Thank you.